got some sort of experience in the subject, it would help, wouldn't it, really? Rather than plugging it out of thin air. So, can I just ask how many of you are familiar with the book The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield? Okay. Well, this, I'll bring this up several times because it's one of my favourite books ever. But I think that one of the central things that stood out for me when I read this book for the first time was the concept that we choose our parents. And I've gone a long way since then, by the way. This was quite some time ago. I will put that into context a little later. But now, the concept we chose our parents, some people find that very difficult to believe because they might have had a very dysfunctional start in life. But certainly, as far as I'm concerned now, that is absolutely true. There's no coincidences in when we were born or choosing our parents, where we were born, etc., etc. And as far as I'm concerned, we take it one step further with the parents because our job is to actually move forward from what our parents stood for. And so my parents, I was actually born in Ghana in West Africa, and my father was out there working for Cadbury's as an agricultural survey officer. And he died when I was 4 months old. My mother, who was a teacher, came back to England within 4 days and went back to live with her parents, both of whom were in education as well. And my grandmother, who at that point in time and thereafter was reclusive, had been a headmistress, and my grandfather a headmaster, so there's a lot of teaching tradition in the family. And my grandfather was also an alderman and chairman of the Statutory Education Committee at the time. And I had quite a dysfunctional childhood, insofar as where I was living was far from ideal for a child, and it was like a mausoleum, and I couldn't bring any friends home. I spent a lot of time on my own. And I suppose the first recollection I have of anything spiritual happening to me was after my grandfather died, and he had a stroke when I was 7 and been bedridden and stuck downstairs in the drawing room up until when I was 13, which is when he passed. And straight afterwards, where my bedroom was right at the end of a very long corridor, and there was a toilet next door. And I saw my granddad, after he passed, in the toilet. Not with his trousers down, but of course I was very, very spooked by this. And thereafter, within a few months, my granny died. And again, I felt her all round me. And normally at times when I was going to make some fatal error in my life, when this came strongest was actually when I was engaged or getting engaged to a very inappropriate man. But right from the word go, my mother, who was very theatrical, was very interested in the spiritual world. She didn't fear anything as far as spirit was concerned at all, but she subscribed to Prediction magazine, and she was there forever going off and seeing mediums and palm readers. There was a lady in Russell, she used to go and see Rachel, who was a wizened old lady, but was very, very good at what she did. And so I was brought up with sort of all of this. And as time went on, when I was in my very formative years, I remember distinctly, I don't know whether any of you remember here, perhaps the older ones of you might, there used to be a guy called David Nixon who was a magician on the telly, and he was a very tall man with white hair, lovely, he seemed to be a really lovely man. And I remember looking at the television when I was a little girl and saying, he's going to die on so-and-so date. And my granny, who used to write everything down, she kept a diary every day, wrote this down, and he duly died on that day. And I did exactly the same thing with Arthur Askin. And so it went on. So when I was 13 and they both died, we actually moved house, and this was a whole new experience for me. And I started seeing mediums myself. And when I was 19, I picked up my first tarot deck and I started doing tarot readings. I lost the plot a little bit spiritually when I was in my 20s because I did my own version of, sex, drugs and rock and roll without the drugs. And but got very entrenched in financial services. I'd started wanting only to be a journalist and had a thwarted career for 6 months. I'd worked for the Express and Star as a trainee journalist, and then the newspaper to which I was to be assigned closed down, and so they dispensed with my services. I was out of work for 6 months, and then went to work for an estate agent, and so it went on that I went to work for another estate agent. I became a partner in the business, and this is where another experience happened when I was with my business partner, and I could only have been about 23 because at the time I was the only female estate agent in Walsall, and which went down, I have to say, like a ton of bricks. And so I remember distinctly going towards Sutton Junction with the Tamworth Road, and we were heading right. My business partner was driving in his car, and which was a Ford Capri, and we were going down towards the town hall. Any of you are familiar with that road? And out of the blue, there was a car in front. They got a trailer attached, and out of the blue, I heard this voice saying, "Stop!" And so I just went, "Stop!" And luckily he did. He actually braked, because right at that very moment, the trailer jackknifed, and had he not braked at that particular moment in time, this trailer would have come off and come smashing into the car, and we would probably have been seriously injured at the very best. So it went on that, carrying on through my financial services career. I went to work for General Accident. I worked for Prudential Property Services before that. I worked for Britannia Building Society, and while I was training to be a financial advisor then, because with financial services you have to go through exams every time you move job. And we were all in leak, and I used to be doing palm readings for all the troops then. And then I went to work for Bristol and West, and while I was there they launched buy-to-let mortgages, and I went to buy one of these. My mother had recently died, and when she died I thought, I can't carry on working here. The administration, my job at that point was business development manager, and there was nobody to administer the mortgages, so whatever business I was developing mortgage-wise, nobody could actually fulfil all of the promises that I was supposed to be making to people, so I thought, I can't carry on. So I left, and after a period of time, this buy-to-let property that I purchased, I ended up working from, and I was doing adverse mortgage packaging from there with an ex-colleague of mine. So working from the back bedroom, we didn't see Joe Public, and all of the brokers and estate agents, etc., that I'd met before in my previous roles, were sending me all of their skanky mortgages, i.e. people with county court judgments and so on and so forth. And I was making an absolute fortune, I have to say. I predicted the first year's turnover would be about 30,000. It was actually in excess of 70, and I just couldn't believe how I could be working from this back bedroom and doing all this. And I was working, very long hours, and then a series of very synchronistic events happened which completely changed my life. And I started hearing this little voice in my ear going, Reiki, 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 Reiki. I've never had a Reiki treatment in my life at this point. And but I found somebody in the market hall in Aldridge, of all places, that was selling crystals, and she was advertising that she was teaching Reiki. So I went along and did my Reiki 1 and Reiki 2. And at the same time, by this time I was working on my own, and at the same time I was doing an undergraduate degree in mortgage lending. And as soon as I started doing Reiki, I thought, I can't stand doing mortgages. I absolutely hate it. I can't carry on doing this. And I thought, what can I do? What can I do? I knew that I couldn't make a living just doing Reiki. And so this went on for a while, and I was having to do more hours because, of course, I was working on my own. And then a dear friend of mine was hospitalised, and he was a lot older than myself, and I went to visit him in hospital one Sunday. And John will bear me out because he came with me. And Jack said to me, he was in his hospital bed, and it was very incongruous, and he came out with, what is this life if full of care we have no time to stand and stare? That's very strange. And when I left, I just said, oh, I'll see you on Wednesday, Jack. And I was planning to go and see him after I went to the dentist. And when I went on the Wednesday, there was his daughter and next door neighbour sobbing at his bedside because he just passed, and I just missed him passing. So those were the last words he ever said to me. And a couple of months later, I had a bleed behind one of my eyes, and this meant that I got tunnel vision. I couldn't drive in the dark. It was coming up to winter time, so I had to seriously cut back on the hours that I was spending at the office. And of course, during this time, I thought, I know what Jack meant. I can't do this anymore. And I also knew that I wanted to do my Reiki Master, but if I did that, I thought that's going to push me over the edge. I'm going to reach a point where, I won't be able to come back from that. I'm going to be just plummeting myself into spirituality. So anyway, I finished my undergraduate degree. I decided that I was going to pack in my business, which I did. I finished everything off, tied everything up, and went home. And went and got myself a job working for a broker 3 days a week, doing his admin, and retrained in past life regression and clinical hypnotherapy. And how opportune, because this happened in 2005, and of course in 2007 the crash happened. So when the crash did happen, I was able to be sort of up and running, as it were, almost with all of the holistic therapies that I now was able to do. So, subsequent to that, I started getting very involved with the Spiritualist Church. Again, this was completely out of the blue. I woke up one morning and I thought, I need to go to the Spiritualist Church. I'd never been to the Spiritualist Church in my life. But I looked on, I thought, well, I know there's one in Walsall, I know there's a couple in Brownhill, so I thought, we really do want to go there. So I went on the internet, found that there was a church in Sutton that I knew nothing about, and took myself along there on this Monday afternoon for the Monday afternoon demonstration. And as I walked into the foyer, this lady came up and she smiled at me. She put her hand on my shoulder. I thought, that's odd. And I went in and sat down. And I thought, well, this didn't look too daunting. I wasn't sure what was going to happen or anything. But sure enough, this lady was one of the mediums. One of the students, actually, that was doing a demonstration that day. And she came to me and she gave me a message from my mother. So, again, I say there's absolutely no coincidences. And as time went on, I got more and more involved with the church, and I was on committee for 2 years and resigned in March this year. So, I've had quite a checkered past, but I have been touched by spirit quite a lot. I'm now in my 4th mediumship development circle, and with a very wonderful Scott Lorney, who is a fantastic tutor, and so it begins to develop, and hopefully one of these days you might see me on the rostrum, but we shall see. So that sort of gives you a pretty broad idea of where I'm coming from. So I know sort of things from various angles. And tonight I'm intending to give you an overview, really, take a very wide brush to this subject, because I didn't see any way I could really tackle it. And so I shall be looking at sort of the history of life after death, where spiritual beginnings, where spiritualism, as we know it in modern day terms, where it arose. And I should be looking at what it means to be a medium, what it means to be a psychic. I should be looking at the, if you like, spiritual senses, because they're certainly not psychic senses, but the spiritual senses. I should be talking a little bit about the Spiritualist Church and obviously the background of that. and also about how the ways in which, other than mediumship, we can evidence life after death. And of course, we've got to start with, spiritualism. Spiritualism as a religion. Of course, it involves a cornerstone of which is the belief that there is life after death. But that is a cornerstone of many religions, as I'll be going into in a little while. The difference between spiritualism and other religions is the belief that mediumship can evidence that life after death. And mediumship takes many forms, and I'll be going into that in a bit of detail as well. I have done detailed notes for myself here because I do tend to talk quite a lot. I mean, you'd never believe that, I know. But I can go off-piste, pun intended.
Gail, may I just ask, could you just speak up a little bit?
Yes, certainly will.
Just this end, we can't hear that well. Thank you very much.
So, a lot of people, are of the belief that belief in spirit and life after death is sort of a new age phenomenon. And that certainly isn't the case, because there's evidence that, for thousands and thousands of years, man's had a belief in life after death. Over 12,000 years ago, Stone Age tribes used to bury their dead in the fetal position, along with their worldly goods, in a belief that there would be an afterlife. And before the earliest civilisations were formed, we find evidence that primitive people in Africa, Asia, the Americas and Australia also had a belief in the cycle of death and rebirth, because that's evidenced with their customs, in their art and in their rituals. And these primitive people, they followed what's known as animism, because they believed that everything from a plant through to a human being was animated by a universal life force. And again, this ties in very much with what we know nowadays, because Reiki means universal life source in Japanese. When we look at Tai Chi, in Chinese tradition, Qi is universal energy. And of course, prana is the equivalent in the Indian tradition. So, these beliefs really formed the basis of the first civilisations, which were in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and that dates back to 3,300 BC, so we're talking a long, long way back. And of course the Egyptians were the first people to speak about the immortal soul, and it's quite interesting that their custom of putting the mummified body in a series of three more refined sarcophagi actually reflects the three elements of the human spirit. So this is the astral body, the body which detaches during out-of-body experiences, the mind, and the immortal soul. And there's evidence that the three pyramids of Giza line up with the three stars in the constellation of Orion in the Milky Way. And of course, to the ancient Egyptians, Orion was mystical, because they believed that Osiris, judge of the dead and ruler of the underworld, actually resided in Orion. And of course, the shape of the pyramids, being like this, was designed in order to magnify the Earth's magnetic energy in order for the astral body to detach more readily from the physical body. And this was actually proven by an English occultist, Dr. Paul Brunton, who did an experiment. He was granted permission to do this experiment within the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. And he had an involuntary out-of-body experience. Then if we look, of course, to ancient Greek, we know that Pythagoras believed that he had many lives. And Plato also believed that the spirit was entombed in the physical body and was only freed upon death, whereupon thereafter it would be entombed in it again in the physical body. The Romans, we know, of course, had their gods, but they also practiced a form of divination. Now, do we know what divination means? Nowadays, I think people regard divination, things like tarot cards or angel cards, using some sort of tools in order for prediction. The word actually comes from the Latin divinare, which means to be inspired by a god. And as far as the Romans were concerned, again, this was completely new to me. The divination that they practiced was called augury, and an augur was a priest who studied the flight patterns of birds in order to interpret the will of the gods. Anybody do that here? I might take it up. And of course, a lot of people recognise that the oldest religion, Hinduism, has got a belief in reincarnation. I mean, the tradition of Hinduism was passed down orally for thousands and thousands of years until it was written down in the Upanishads, which date back to between 800 and 1200 BC. And then we look at Buddhism. And do any of you know the rigmarole that's gone through when we're looking for a new Dalai Lama? I will read to you, actually, it's quite a good little piece from a book here that sheds quite a bit of light on the subject. The Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama means greatest teacher, is regarded as the incarnation of Teretse, the Buddhist god of grace, and he has taken earthly form 14 times since 1391. Each time a Dalai Lama dies, the Lamas of Tibet have the task of finding his reincarnated form. A male child born after his death will then be brought up to take on the leadership of the Tibetan Buddhist community. When the 13th Dalai Lama died in 1933, it took the monks 6 years to find his successor. The search involves sifting a variety of normal and paranormal clues. The Lamas scrutinise astrological signs, visions, dreams and other omens to establish where they should start their quest. And after the 13th Dalai Lama's death, the corpse itself offered one clue. It turned its head towards the northeast. Then in the mausoleum where he was laid, a star-shaped fungus grew on the northeast wall. In the main courtyard of the monastery housing the tomb, a dragonflower unexpectedly grew on the northeast wall. And the Lamas decided that it was in this direction that they should begin their search. To help them came a vision in a dream granted to one of the monastery's monks. He saw a place sacred to Buddhism, a lake at Choskorolga in China, and a house with carved gables and eaves painted blue. Near here, the Lamas concluded they would find the child they were seeking. And in 1937, a group of Lamas and monks set off for China to find the house. 2 years later, at the village of Taxta, they found it. One of the high Lamas in the party disguised himself as a servant and went into the house. He found inside a 2-year-old boy, Tenzin Gyatso, who instantly demanded the rosary that beneath his disguise the Lama was wearing around his neck. This was not the Lama's, but it had belonged to the Dalai Lama. Tenzin Gyatso also identified and recognised other rosaries, a drum and a walking stick that had also belonged to the former Dalai Lama. And encouraged by these initial signs, the Lamas went on to look for physical confirmation that the boy was the current embodiment of Teretse. The various bodily characteristics, moles and birthmarks found on every Dalai Lama were indeed in place. And the Lama set about making arrangements for the boy and his family to travel to Tibet. Among these was paying a $3,000 ransom to the provincial governor for allowing Teretse Gyatso to live in China, but eventually the infant Dalai Lama was installed in the Patala Palace above Lhasa to begin his long and arduous training to become the spiritual and temporal leader of the Tibetan nation. And then, of course, we look at Christianity. Now, reincarnation was a central tenet of early Christianity. But following a lot of political wrangling, the Roman Emperor Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, relocated the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople. And he did this wanting to establish greater control over the Christian church. He appointed a number of bishops, and these were sent out to, not because of their spiritual prowess, but to do his bidding, really, because he deemed that there were only two lives, one in the here and now, and another life in the hereafter, in the form of resurrection. Any deviation from this belief was a crime punishable by death. And so there emerged over a period of time a big split within the Christian church. And then the Roman emperor then, who was Justinian in the 6th century, 553 AD, in an attempt to assert himself and quell his dissenters, he put through a raft of amendments to the Bible, which all but airbrushed out Jesus' and disciples' core teachings. So the idea that Jesus arose physically from the dead is something that's been invented by the church, essentially. There was a lot of stuff taken out of the Bible that made any reference to reincarnation, and so what's left gives the impression that Jesus came back from the dead physically, whereas there is quite, still little bits and pieces, so that in Corinthians and in Peter, it's stated that flesh and blood cannot enter the celestial kingdom. In chapter 3 of John, he says that heaven is for spiritual beings, and we're all spiritual in essence, and we'll return from whence we came. When we look at St. Paul, he tried to clarify the matter even further, again in Corinthians, when he said, there are celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial, and the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is a physical body and there is a spiritual body. When we look at the Jewish tradition, modern day Jews again have no belief in reincarnation. Now, in traditional Jewish services, prayers are given asking for forgiveness for sins committed not just in this life, but other incarnations. How does that work? When we look at Islam, again, they have no belief in reincarnation, supposedly, but there are clear references in the Quran. And in chapter 2 of the Quran, it's stated, God generates beings and sends them out over and over again until they return to him. When we look at chapter 11, it's God is the one who created you, then gave you sustenance, then will cause you to die, then will bring you to life. I can't think of any other reason why that's there, other than originally there was a belief in reincarnation. Can you? So, bring us back up to date. I mean, there is still a reluctance with many people here in the West to fully embrace the concept of life after death. And this is where my favourite book comes in, because to put this into some sort of perspective, I want to read you this extract from the Celestine Prophecy, because I think it covers this off very well. The main character, who continues to be nameless in the Celestine Prophecy, is on board a flight to Peru where he meets a history professor called Dobson, and it's Dobson who talks. And so he says, in the year of 1000, the Middle Ages, life is defined by churchmen of the Christian church who hold great power over the minds of the people. It was a simple world of good or evil, and whether you were a peasant or aristocrat, your social position is secondary to the spiritual reality of life as defined by the churchmen. Life's all about passing a spiritual test, they explain, that God has placed mankind at the centre of his universe, surrounded by the entire cosmos for one purpose, to win or lose salvation. You don't have to choose your status. The church will interpret the scriptures and tell you every step of the way whether you're with God or with the devil. If you follow their instruction, you're assured a rewarding afterlife, and if not, excommunication and damnation. All the phenomena of life is defined as either the will of God or the malice of the devil. There's no concept of weather, science, disease. You take for granted what you've been told, that everything operates solely by spiritual means. And by the 14th and 15th centuries, this worldview begins to fall apart. It's noted that the churchmen, those sole arbitrators of your salvation, are secretly violating the vows of chastity, taking bribes when government officials break scriptural laws. There's a rebellion. A group led by Martin Luther calls for a complete break from papal Christianity, as the churchmen are corrupt and an end to their reign is demanded. A rebellion ensues and calls for each person to have access to the scriptures personally so they can interpret them as they wish. The rebellion succeeds, and the whole worldview regarding the nature of the universe as defined by the churchmen has been thrown into question. There was tremendous upheaval. By the 1600s, astronomers proved that the sun and the stars don't revolve around the earth, as the church had maintained. The earth was a small planet orbiting a minor sun in a galaxy containing millions of stars. And Dobson says mankind had lost his way at the centre of God's universe. People watching the weather or plants growing or someone suddenly dying suddenly felt anxious bafflement. In the past you may have said that God was responsible or the devil. What now? So the modern age begins, a growing democratic spirit and a mass distrust of papal and royal authority. This created a new mandate for science, to go and scientifically explore this new world and discover its true reality. Explorers were sent out to bring back a complete explanation of our existence. That took time, and while we waited in that time 4 centuries ago, we decided to take matters into our own hands, raise our standard of living and sense of security in the world. We focused on conquering the earth and using its resources to better our situation, and this focus became a preoccupation. We totally lost ourselves in creating a secular security, an economic security to replace the spiritual one we'd lost. The question of why we were alive and what was actually going on spiritually was slowly pushed aside and repressed altogether. Working to establish a more comfortable style of survival has grown to feel complete in and of itself as a reason to live, and we're gradually, methodically forgetting our original question. We've forgotten that we still don't know what we're surviving for. Very succinctly put, isn't it? And so eventually, of course, the time arose for sensitives to re-emerge. And according to the Spiritualist National Union, this happened, the modern spiritualist movement is deemed to date from the 31st of March 1848 in Hydesville, New York State. And there were 2 sisters, Catherine and Margaret Fox, who, it says, were able to establish intelligent communication with a spirit that was making rapping noises in their house. And this spread like wildfire. Their mother was dutifully impressed, and she told the neighbours, and the neighbours told their neighbours, and it was like it lit the torch paper. So within a few years, spiritualist circles and societies had sprung up all across the United States of America. Of course, what the Spiritualist National Union website fails to tell you is that 40 years later, in 1888, Maggie, as she was known, because when this happened, Maggie was 15 and her sister was 11, Maggie actually said that she'd made it all up. In an interview she did with the New York World newspaper, as I say, 40 years later. About 12 months after that, she retracted her statement, but of course the damage was done by then, and her reputation was in shreds. By this stage, both of the sisters were in end-stage alcoholism in any event. And it strikes me as rather odd. I mean, I understand in a certain way, but it strikes me as rather odd that, again, you know, the SNU used selective editing for this, and you know, I suppose the journalist in me wants to put both sides. But anyway, so in Britain in the 1850s, there was an American medium called Mrs. Maria Hayden, and she was both persecuted and insulted by press and the pulpit. But her mediumship had drawn a lot of attention from many public figures, and notably one Welsh socialist, Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was one of the founders of the cooperative movement, and he changed from being completely ambivalent towards religion to becoming a spiritualist at the tender age of 83. So there is hope for some of you that haven't embraced it yet. Because he had a number of sittings with this said Maria Hayden. And thereafter, the first spiritualist newspaper sprang up in Kiley in Yorkshire in 1855, along with the first spiritualist newspaper in the same year. And by the 1870s, there were spiritualist churches and societies throughout the whole of the country. Then we come to Emma Hardinge Britton, and she founded the Two Worlds Spiritualist Weekly newspaper as it was then. The Two Worlds still exists in magazine form. And she channeled the 7 principles of spiritualism from that same Robert Owen, who, of course, by that time passed the spirit on after. She couldn't have channeled them anyway. And this Emma Hardinge Britton, she was a very good speaker and very organised, very gifted writer. And the task to unifying all of these churches and societies really fell to her. She became one of the co-authors of the Lyceum Manual, which is a collection of Hume's teachings and writings that helped to coalesce the spiritualist movement. And of course, by 1948, the Spiritualist National Union was born in that year. And today, the SNU, Spiritualist National Union, has jurisdiction over most, but not all, of the spiritualist churches in the country. And so before I talk about that in a little bit more detail, I want to share with you quite a funny story, because I said I was going to debunk a few odd ideas that people have, and I thought it was very amusing. There was a medium that appeared at Sutton Church some time ago now, and she told the tale of when she was serving another church. I think it was somewhere up in Derbyshire, she said, and she got lost en route. It was her first time there. And so she did what all of us girlies do when we're lost, especially when we haven't got a sat-nav. And she went into a petrol station to ask directions, and the cashier behind the counter was there. And she said, "Oh, can you tell me where such and such a road is?" And the cashier said, "Yeah, I know where that is. What are you looking for on that road?" And so the medium said, "Well, I'm looking for the spiritualist church because I'm actually serving the church today." And the cashier leaned forward and she said, "Is it true you all go around and hold hands naked?" We don't, by the way. I just want to point that out. It might be a bit more fun sometimes if that was the case, but no. Spiritualism is a recognised religion. It has its own churches and ministers who have the same rights and privileges as any other church and any other religion. So, marriage ceremonies and funerals, etc., can take place there. And its philosophy is based on the 7 principles that were channeled by Emma Hardinge Britton from said Robert Owen. And I forgot to say that Robert Owen, while he was still with us, said that he was in spiritual communication with 2 American presidents, I understand. And so I thought that's quite interesting. Anyway, so I'll tell you the spiritualist principles. They are the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the communion of the spirits and ministry of the angels, the continuous existence of the human soul, personal responsibility, compensation and retribution for any good or evil deeds done on the earth, and eternal progress open to every human soul. And you'll find in many spiritualist churches this will be prominently displayed. Certainly it's Sutton Coldfield Church, this is on the back wall of where the rostrum is. So everybody that is in the congregation or audience, whatever you want to call it, can see these principles quite a lot. So when we're looking at the spiritualist churches, there are a few independent churches, but as I say, most of them are run by the Spiritualist National Union. And these fall into categories of Christian spiritualist churches and just spiritualist churches. And this is a bit of a grey area, really. Still, I've asked a couple of mediums, well, more than a couple actually, what's the difference between these two, and I can't get a clear answer. But it seems to be that, you know, in Christian spiritualist churches, there is more a lean towards the teachings of Jesus, and that shouldn't be the case in ordinary spiritualist churches. But I say it's a grey area because, you know, they still have carol services in all the churches as far as I know, and they still have Easter decorations up, and it would be a bit hypocritical, wouldn't it, really, to do that. But anyway, just my view. So, in terms of the services that go on at the church, and you know, and I speak of Sutton Church mostly because I haven't been to that many spiritualist churches, I have to say. But in all of the churches, there will be a divine service. And the divine service, which takes place on a Sunday, will include some spiritual philosophy, which will be based on one of the 7 principles. There will be a reading, which will again have got sort of spiritual connotations, and then a demonstration of mediumship. And there will also be other services during the week at some stage where there will be demonstrations of mediumship. Anybody here not been to a spiritualist church? Okay. So essentially the medium stands on the rostrum, or several mediums, and they will sometimes go directly to members of the audience and give them a message. The general theme, certainly in terms of people who are on the experiments course, it appears to me, which is the training course for training mediums that's run by the SNU. They will give a description of the person who they've got in spirit. They will say the reason for passing, and they'll give a message to that person. And there might be only bits, but that's the core of what they need to say to people, as determined by the SNU. SNU churches, the SNU act as trustees. So individual churches have members, and these are members who pay an annual subscription, and they have, after a certain period of time, they'll have voting rights at the AGM. They can nominate people to be on committee, and it will be the committee that make decisions on behalf of the members. And as with any committee, there will be officers, so there'll be president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and then all the committee members. And of course, one of the big things that goes on in the church is spiritual healing. And spiritual healing, certainly at Sutton Church, is undertaken twice a week. Now, I want to talk a little bit, if I may, about the difference between psychics and mediums, because a lot of people have got the idea that these two are interchangeable, and that isn't the case at all. Because psychic work really should mean that you are working with energy in the here and now, because we're all of us psychic. We pick things up because our solar plexus here is like a satellite dish. So we're picking up energies of people who are here on the Earth plane. And so, you know, when you've walked into a room and someone's had a terrible argument, and you'll know, because you'll say, oh, it could cut the atmosphere with a knife. It might be that you start getting, if you're very sensitive, you might pick up or start feeling very ratty when you walk into a supermarket or down the high street, because you're picking up everybody else's negative energies, if you like. So psychic energy is working on the here and now, and psychic readings are all about working with that energy in the here and now. That is very different from mediumship, because mediumship means that you are a channel, a medium, or an area, if you like, from up there to down here. So you are getting either healing or messages from the spirit world and bringing those for people still on the earth plane. So that is, quite a bit different. And when we're talking about mediumship, of course, we're talking about lots of different ways that people are mediums. Because like we have, and I'll go into what's called the clairs now, because like our physical senses, we will have one sense which is more pronounced than others. It might be that, somebody's got a fantastic sense of smell and the person next to you has got a wonderful eyesight. And so it is spiritually. So again, it is totally wrong for somebody to say, oh, we've got a clairvoyant demonstration this afternoon. Because clairvoyance, clair, before anything, means clear. So if you are somebody who sees spirit, either objectively, like somebody standing here, or subjectively in your head, then you are clairvoyant. You could also be clairsentient, which is clear feeling. You could be clairaudient, where you hear voices outside of you, or voices in your head, or taste, clairgustorial, or you might smell things, clairaroma. So when somebody is giving a demonstration mediumship, they will use one or all of those, and each medium will be very, very different, because they will have one or more of those senses, which is more pronounced than others. Now, a fantastic book which gives a really, really good account of clairaudience is The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. I don't know if anybody's read that here, but I would strongly recommend that you do. I think we're going to be a little bit short of time, so I won't read the extract I was going to do, but that is literally about a guy who was a heroin addict, 62, who went to try and admit himself into A&E and was sent out because they wanted him to be sent to a detox clinic. And so he rushed out of the hospital and was hit and killed by a car. His sister, when she found out, was weeping and wailing and gnashing her teeth for 3 weeks. And then suddenly she heard his voice calling her. And calling her as if he was up and to the right is how she describes. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And so basically he is speaking to her and describing what life is like in the afterlife. So I'd strongly recommend you get that, The Afterlife. It is Annie Kagan. Kagan. Annie Kagan, fantastic. There are also, of course, things called apports, which is, again, quite interesting. And I want to read you a bit about this because it's apport is something physical coming through. So, the late Anita Gregory was a distinguished scholar, a stalwart of the Society of Psychic Research in Britain, and by no means gullible when it came to paranormal matters. She spent considerable energy on showing how weak she believed the evidence was that anything truly strange had happened in the famous Enfield poltergeist case, for example. But at a seance held by medium Paul McElroy in London in the early 1980s, Mrs. Gregory was astonished and baffled when a small metal model of the Cologne Cathedral landed in the palm of her hand from nowhere. McElroy's spirit control, called himself Seros, explained through McElroy that the model was a gift to Mrs. Gregory from her dead father. At the time, this made little sense to her. Only later did she discover that her father and mother had spent their honeymoon in a hotel that looked out onto Cologne Cathedral. Paul McHenry was a relatively rare phenomenon himself during the late 20th century, a spiritualist medium who produced physical phenomena. His peculiar talent was to produce objects, as Mrs. Gregory so plainly put it, apparently from nowhere, otherwise known as apports. His speciality was to bring forth flowers, often made from his mouth. However he managed this feat, there was no doubt among the witnesses that they were all fresh. Unlike many other mediums, McElhenney would do this often in good light, as well as in the more traditional and for sceptics more suspicious circumstances of a darkened seance room. And there's another one here, which I find remarkable. Among mediums who produced apports, one of the most remarkable during the 19th century was undoubtedly Mademoiselle Elizabeth d'Esperance, actually a lady of English origin, whose most astonishing effects were produced through the spirit of a 15-year-old Arab girl called Yolande, who actually materialised as an entire physical form during Madame d'Esperance's seances. At a seance held on the 28th of June 1890, this medium and the materialised Yolande produced a flower, but not just any flower, or some sparkling hothouse bloom, but the seedling of a golden lily that in front of the astonished sitters grew before their eyes to the height of 7 feet, and in the process 7 of the 11 flowers on the plant came into bloom and exuded a powerful scent. If this had been some species of vaudeville act, a professional conjurer would have made sure that the plant was not either whisked away from prying eyes and sceptical inspection, or equally magically made to vanish. In this case, the spirit form of Yolande was disconcerted when she announced sadly that a giant lily couldn't be made in the material world, and then found that it refused to dematerialise. Finally, she told the sitters to keep the recalcitrant plant in a darkened room until they next met a week later on the 5th of July. The instructions were obeyed, and at the next seance, the oversized lily was put squarely in the centre of the seance room, and at 9:23 p.m, within 7 minutes it had disappeared, but not before 2 of the flowers had been kept as mementos of its brief existence, and photographs taken of the massive plant in the company of the medium. So that's 2 examples of things. But of course, things like automatic writing, will come from spirit. There was a wonderful artist, I don't know whether you remember him, I think he's in this book as well. If I show you his picture, Matthew Murray, who was able, just when he picked up a paintbrush, to start painting like the masters. Spiritual art can take many forms. That sort of spiritual art, or also, of course, somebody able to draw a picture of somebody with whom they're communicating in spirit. And of course, there are lots of other ways, apart from mediumship, in which to evidence life after death. And this includes out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and regression. And regression can be either spontaneous regression or guided past life regression, which of course is what I do, although I have a spontaneous regression experience. And I want to read you an extract from about out-of-body experiences from a book called I Remember Dying by Paul Rowland, which is again very succinct. The belief that every individual has an immortal soul that survives bodily death is common to almost every culture and civilization in recorded history. The idea that we all possess a spirit double that leaves the body at the moment of death and possibly even during sleep is a core feature of 57 cultures, as diverse as the Azand in Africa, Inuit of Alaska, Barayes in South America, as well as being an underlying principle of all the most religions. Yet Western society considers itself too sophisticated and worldly to accept what has been a central concept of almost every culture since prehistoric times. Both out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences are recurring features in the sacred literature of all major world religions, faiths and philosophies. There's a common concept of life after death, but it has become obscured and confused with the passage of time and by the often willful misinterpretation and selective editing of scriptures by those who sought to set themselves up as mediators between man and God. The ritual practice of soul travel, or astral projection, as it's known in the esoteric tradition, is still central to the tribal societies of Africa, Australasia, North America, South America, and the Antarctic, where shamans are entrusted with healing, appeasing the nature spirits, and escorting the dead to the netherworld, With a combination of ritual drumming, dancing, chanting and fasting and natural narcotics, they induce a state of ecstasy, and the true meaning of the word ecstasy is to stand outside, allowing them to leave their bodies and commune with their spirit guides, animals and ancestors. Plato wrote of one of the earliest recorded accounts of near-death experience in Western literature, the story of a fallen soldier, whose voyage through the underworld was an attempt to introduce the concept into Greek natural consciousness. In the 1st century AD, the Greek biographer Plutarch recorded the allegedly true experience of Aridaeus of Asia Minor, who left his body after receiving a blow to the head. While wandering confused in the space between the world, Aridaeus met his deceased uncle, who reassured him that he was still alive and would return to his body without further delay. In this same essay, Plutarch refers to the limitations of the silver cord, which prevent Aridaeus from venturing further into the afterlife. Your soul's cable is stretched down your body to which it is anchored and allows no further slack or play. The implication being that Aridaeus is still bound to the body and it's not his time to leave. Both out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences are invariably the result of a physical, mental or emotional crisis of some kind, and almost always when the body is inactive, though there are rare cases when the spirit is separated during normal waking life. Writers and poets including Dickens, Tennyson, Emily Bronte, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway and Aldous Huxley are known to have drawn on their own out-of-body experiences for inspiration. The poet Shelley is said to have been amused when informed his astral twin had been observed several miles away by his friends, among them his literary rival, Lord Byron. However, on one occasion when Shelley caught sight of his own double, it proved to be a prophecy of his own death. The doppelganger was pointing out to sea, indicating the place where the poet later drowned in a boating accident. Dr. Robert Crookall, a noted English researcher into out-of-body phenomena, recorded the case of a mother who sensed that her newly married daughter had fallen sick during the sea voyage, and her concern unconsciously projected her body across the ocean to give the girl some motherly advice. The daughter later wrote to her mother in a state of mild shock, describing the moment where she'd been visited by the living apparition and detailing the conversation between them, all of which corroborated the mother's story down to the precise time of the meeting. Aviator Charles Lindbergh, who made his first solo transatlantic flight in 1926, took 50 years to admit that he'd had an out-of-body experience in the final hours of that flight. He said, "I existed independently of time and matter. I felt myself departing from my body as I imagine a spirit would depart, but I remained connected to my body through a long, extended strand, a strand so tenuous that it could have been severed by a breath. My visions are easily explained away through reason, but the longer I live, the more limited I believe rationality to be." And then we move on to near-death experiences. And the term near-death experience was actually coined by Dr. Raymond Moody. And in 1965, Moody was a 20-year-old philosophy student. And he was attending a seminar in the University of Virginia, and they were discussing whether or not man has an immortal soul. The debate was speculative until the professor mentioned a neuropsychical psychiatrist who claimed to have had a life-changing out-of-body experience after being pronounced clinically dead. And a few months later, Moody heard Seb Ritchie tell this story to his students. But it wasn't until 4 years later, after Moody qualified and was teaching philosophy himself, that he heard of a similar case from one of his students, and he became so interested in it, he began to compile a dossier of cases like this near-death experience. And by 1975, he collected enough empirical evidence to publish his first book, Life After Life, which became an international bestseller. And Moody identified a number of common elements that appear to have been shared by thousands of other individuals who've made similar claims in subsequent studies. In almost every case, the process of death was characterised by an absence of pain and an overwhelming sense of security and serenity, which allayed any fears from the moment of separation, even in cases of violent or sudden death. Many patients described the ecstasy they felt on finding themselves floating free of their physical body and watching as the doctors and nurses frantically attempted to revive them. Several record trying in vain to tell them not to bother, that they were happy to be rid of the burden of their sick or injured body, but nobody seemed aware of their presence. Curiously, the deceased could hear everything the medical team said during the crisis and were later able to repeat it. They're able to describe precisely what happened while technically dead, the details of which were subsequently verified by hospital staff. And many spent what they'd later learned had been several minutes out of the body, during which they were drawn down a long, dark tunnel to emerge in a pastoral landscape where they were welcomed by deceased relatives and friends. And of course, celebrity near-death experiences include Peter Sellers, Donald Sutherland, Elizabeth Taylor, Larry Hagman, Tony Bennett, Sharon Stone, Burt Reynolds. And there is actually scientific evidence for this in actually the 25th anniversary edition of that book by Raymond Moody. The guy writing the preface is an MD, and he cites a number of people. First generation of near-death researchers included Dr. Ken Ring, Professor of Psychology, Professor of Psychiatry, Professor of Neuropsychiatrist, etc., that reached the same conclusions as Dr. Moody. These numerous other researchers documented that the experience were real and not the results of hallucination or brain pathology. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to be a panellist on The Big Question. I've never heard of The Big Question actually, but it goes out on a Sunday morning, hosted by Nick Campbell. Not my finest hour, I have to say, for a number of reasons. But anyway, the question was, is there life after death? And of course, they'd asked me a lot because I do past life regression. And I got talking to one of the other panellists in the green room, a guy called Ken Spearpoint. And he's a consultant nurse in the resource department of Hammersmith Hospital. And a lovely, lovely man with no religious, bent at all. Just interested in resuscitation. He started studying near-death experiences, and he told me what had happened recently to him was that there had been a gentleman in the resus department who'd been clinically dead for 20 minutes, and he'd been repeatedly paddled. And after 20 minutes, they managed to actually get him back. And what this guy, Ken Spearpoint, was telling me was exactly as Moody described in his book. And I have to say, exactly as I've experienced with people who have come to me for past life regression. And in terms of regression, of course, a lot of work was done. There are a lot of people that have been, especially children, that have spontaneous past life regression memories. And a lot of these were documented by a guy called Professor Ian Stevenson. And he was the head of psychology at the University of Virginia and travelled the world doing in-depth interviews and cataloguing all of these people and made a huge collection of cases concluding that these are suggestive of reincarnation. My personal experience with regressions, a lot of people of course can say that the subconscious mind makes all of this up, and it was very funny. I mean, I truly believe very much in synchronicity, and I've told you, synchronistic events that happened to me that got me on my spiritual path. But I was thinking to myself, I was preparing for this talk, the concept that people's subconscious minds make up these past life regression experiences is called cryptomnesia. And although I've been doing past life regression since 2007, I've never had what I would call a definitive case that I could say was obviously made up by the subconscious mind. Until 2 days ago. And a lady's been coming to see me for some time, and I have, I'm obviously keeping details confidential, but although I did say that I would mention tonight. And she's been coming to see me for a month or two now, and she's got a serious psychological problem that's been going on for 30 years. And we've done a lot of work together because certain things have happened that could possibly have been the cause of this psychological problem. And she'd done a lot of work there, and we sort of cleared all that and a lot of forgiveness stuff, etc. And still the problem persisted. And again, the voice in my ear said to me, got to be a regression. So that's what we did on Tuesday. And she described being in a black room. And so I said, we'll go into the room and feel along the walls. And so she felt along the walls, which felt a bit damp. And then she described these cells in the room. And in each one of these cells was a man chained to the wall. And she was wandering through this place as herself, in a white robe, almost an angelic white robe. You know, the pure higher self her was going on this journey. And it quickly became obvious to me that this was her subconscious mind actually showing her what she's doing to herself. She needed to see objectively in this experience what she was doing, and that's exactly what happened. And I'm happy to report that as a result of that, she's made, you know, each one of these cells was a significant problem. She's a Virgo, so she's very tidy-minded, and she's very regime-led. And she's kept to the same regime for nearly 30 years. She's broken each one of those within the last 2 days because of this experience. People forget that past life regression is a therapy. So, you know, whether it's made up or whether it's a real experience that can be verified in some way, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the person feels better at the end of it, because the end result with, when somebody has a successful regression, is that it will help that person in their current life right now. And so, you know, the opposite end of the scale, somebody saying, oh, it's made up, would be one of my experience with that was introduced to me by a mutual friend, who, this lady's a medium, and she came to me years and years ago now, and had left school when she was 15, you know, didn't have a terrific education, and she started a regression experience, and she was speaking fluent French. Now, I did French to O level. It was the only O level I failed because, you know, although, you know, I'm pretty good with language, I'm good at English and profanity. And other than that, I'm not good at languages at all. But I knew that what she was saying to me wasn't just sort of cafe French, for want of a better phrase. And so I asked her to speak in English. So, you know, that could not have been made up by her, you know, and I my knowledge of French is sufficient to know that that wasn't something that she concocted. I've had, you know, people have regression experiences that have cured them of obsessive compulsive disorder, very, very diverse bits and pieces. And of course there are scientific ways to measure to establish whether subjects are actually in an altered state of consciousness. And you can use an electroencephalograph. Oh, I'm so glad I don't drink anymore. Studies showed that past lives are being accessed when brain levels measure 8.3 cycles per second, apparently. You know, for those without machines, such as myself, rapid eye movement, tearing of the eye, reddening of the eye, those are all an indication that somebody is in an altered state of awareness. And in this altered state, of course, you know, subconscious memories can be accessed. Now, another thought is, well, you know, why do we forget our past lives? One of the main reasons, of course, is that, you know, we're supposed to come here with a clean sheet, because we set ourselves lessons to learn in each incarnation, and we don't learn those lessons if we're influenced by past lives. But children especially do remember past lives, and how does that happen? Now, I mentioned Professor Ian Stevenson. Many of the past life regression cases that he studied were over in the East, where there is people do have a belief in reincarnation, and so they are looking for things like birthmarks, and they're looking for when their child suddenly starts talking about past life. Corresponding birthmarks to the exit wounds of where they were killed in their previous life is quite common. And there is a scientific reason why we don't remember. And that is because just before birth, the womb is flooded by oxytocin. And in lab experiments on mice, oxytocin renders those mice completely amnesiac. So they don't remember anything, even when they've been trying to do things before now. So when I first read this, I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that means that if people have been delivered by caesarean section, they're more likely to remember past lives. And one of the guys that came to see me for a regression, I was talking to him about it afterwards, and he said to me that both of his daughters remember past lives, and both of those have been delivered by C-section. So that gives you a bit to think about. I've had to cut short, what I was going to say, because it's not going to leave room for any questions and answers otherwise. But I will end by saying that for me, as a conclusion, spirituality is, well, I'll quote from Neil Donald Walsh first, actually. He wrote Conversations with God, which again is a wonderful book to read. Everybody ought to read it, it's usually compulsory. He says, spirituality doesn't require you to believe anything. Rather, it continually invites you to notice your experience. Your personal experience becomes your authority, rather than something that someone else has told you. Because spirituality is more than just a religion. Spirituality is feeling a connection with the divine yourself. And to me, that's something that I live and breathe every day, and runs throughout everything that I do. And if I can help to facilitate or ignite a flame in anybody else, then that's what I intend to do to my dying breath. So I thank you all for listening, and I invite questions now. I'm not saying I'll be able to answer them all, but we can try. Yes?
It's not a question, it's more a comment. You were talking earlier about your knowledge basically coming from the SNU and not knowing exactly what the independent or Christian Spiritualist church is.
Yeah.
I run a Christian Spiritualist.
Yes, I was going to ask you actually.
Church.
I'm glad you've spoken.
And the only interference, if you want to call it, of the organisation is that we pay them a yearly fee to be affiliated to them.
Right.
So we are just more open to allowing our visiting mediums to talk about what they want. So they're not so confined by just talking about 7 principles. We follow exactly the same format. We have prayers, hymns, readings, and our readings can be very wide. So they could be something religious, Bible orientated, but more often than not, they're just a pretty poem or something with a little moral. But the mediums that come to us, and a lot of them are SNU, but quite a few do come and say, are you independent, are you Christian Spiritualists? Because they know then they can talk about perhaps a wider number of things. They can talk about reincarnation if they want to, they can talk about Jesus if they want to, but we're open to anybody talking about anything, because it's
And long may we run.
and it's individual choice whether you believe it or not. So
Absolutely right.
but very similar in format. It's just
and
we're a
where's
little
your
bit
church?
in Lichfield.
Lichfield, yeah.
What was it called again?
Lichfield Spiritualist Church and Healing Centre.
Where is that?
Cook
How
House.
many past
Oh,
lives?